I originally thought I was going to do a history of the city, but Joellen has already done that, and I hope that if you don't have a copy of her book that you'll get one, because it really is one of the best local history books that I've seen in St. Louis County. Covering, it's all pictures, but it covers from the beginning right up to current issues. So instead I'm going to be looking in a chronological way, but at certain key elements in the history of the community. And I'm going to start with the name of the community. And I'm going to sit because otherwise I'm afraid you won't be able to see the screen. The name Richmond is a French name that even as late as the 1500s it was sometimes written Richmond, which would be rich mountain or well-watered mountain. And it refers to a castle in northern Yorkshire, Richmond Castle, which is still a very dramatic ruin. And this actually goes back before the Normans conquered England to the Saxon times, but it was rebuilt under the Normans, and a series of prominent leaders were designated Earl of Richmond. In 1456, Henry Tudor inherited the title Earl of Richmond. His father had been the half-brother of Henry VI of England, and Henry VII defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. This has been in the news recently because the supposed remains of Richard III have just recently been discovered by a group of archaeologists. And so he became the king and moved to London. In 1501 rather, he started work on a new castle on the outskirts of the city, upriver from London on the River Thames, which he called Richmond Castle after his title, Earl of Richmond, and people still referred to him as Richmond for short. This was a very large castle that survived until the early 1700s, and here are two views of it. In the lower one, you can actually see the old spelling still in use, and this is the middle of the 1500s. The great thing about the site of the castle was immediately adjacent was one of the most beautiful views in England, Richmond Hill, which had this panoramic view over the River Thames. And this was so celebrated that Parliament passed a law in 1901 protecting it. It's the only view in England that even to this day is protected by national legislation. So this was celebrated by artists and writers for several centuries. And this is a painting from the 19th century showing the way the view looked then, and here's the way it looks now, which is still pretty much the way it did then. It's been very well preserved. So you may have heard stories about the town Richmond Heights being named for Richmond, Virginia, but I prefer to think that it was named for Richmond Hill in England, going back to Richmond Castle, because that was the place that was a high point, that was a celebrated place, that would have been a fashionable name, that English residents would have attracted real estate buyers in the 1890s when the first Richmond Heights subdivision was laid out. Now I'm going to go back before the city was laid out and show what the original land subdivisions looked like. And this is a township map. These are congressional townships. The Ordinance of 1787 authorized the federal government to subdivide all the land west of the original 13 colonies into a series of square mile grids, 6 by 6, and a square mile is 640 acres. So we are in Township 45, Range 6 East, which is 36 square miles. And unfortunately for the surveyors, when they got to the Louisiana Territory, a lot of the land had already been given away, and they had not followed the cardinal points of the compass, they had followed the local bodies of water instead. So the maps in this part of Missouri are very complicated because they're overlay of these early French grants with the grid that was imposed by the Americans. And in here you can see there are two exceptionally large tracts. This is 2,700 acres, Survey 378, which was given to Marie-Thérèse Chouteau Papin. She was the second daughter of Pierre Laclede and Madame Chouteau, the founders of St. Louis. Below that is a much larger tract, which was given to her brother-in-law, Charles Gratiot, who was married to the youngest sister, Victoire. Charles was from Lausanne, Switzerland originally, and he had come to the Illinois country in the 1770s. He came across the river to St. Louis in 1781 and married Victoire within 5 months of getting here. He knew a good thing. And he was also a very good-looking guy, which I'll show you in a minute. And he was able to get the Spanish government to give him large tracts of land all over the state, more and larger tracts than almost anybody else because of his prominent position. And this one, 2037, is 5,716 acres, or almost 9 square miles. It was called the Gratiot League Square, and many people have interpreted that as meaning that there was a league of property owners who got together, but no, it was because it measured a league on either side. A league is an antique unit of measurement that can be anywhere from 2.4 to 6.4 miles, but in this case, it was probably around 2.8 miles. So it's still a huge piece of land. And the thing that's so key to Richmond Heights is the west edge of this is Big Bend Boulevard. So the whole east part of Richmond Heights is in the Gratiot League Square. Here's a picture of Charles. You can see he was very dashing. He lived downtown at the corner of 2nd and Main, which was between the main market hall, which is here, and the river. So you're looking at the back of the house over here. This was the original Chouteau mansion here with the church immediately behind it. And if you think of where the old cathedral is now, if you just look immediately toward the river from the side of the cathedral, his house was just by the river to the left. And here's a picture of what it looked like originally. He spent most of his time abroad, however, in New York and Boston and other points on the East Coast, New Orleans, and even in Europe. He was internationally known as a businessman. Looking at this more detailed part of that original map, you see 3 squares here that have M next to them. And M refers to the New Madrid earthquake of 1811-1812. The damage that was done by that earthquake, which was really 2 earthquakes, both over 7 on the Richter scale, was enormous. And every so often you read about what would happen if we had a New Madrid earthquake today with all this population. There was very little population then, but the farmers were severely impacted. So Congress said, we'll give you certificates that you can trade in for comparable land in other parts of the state. And of course, what you might expect happened. All the sharp traders ran down to New Madrid and bought these certificates from the farmers who didn't really want to move, and then brought them back up here and cashed them in as close as possible to St. Louis, because that's where the trading center of the region was. So the Bissell Estate in North St. Louis County, which the County Parks Department owns the Daniel Bissell House, that was assembled from New Madrid certificates. And J.B.C. Lucas's estate of Normandy, which is now the Normandy region, was also assembled from these New Madrid certificates. So the ones you're looking at here, M11 was Joseph Farland, 640 acres, a square mile. M91 was Louis Lefebvre, 170 acres. And M152 is Charles Matthews, another 170 acres. None of those people lived here. Those are the names of the farmers whose name was on the certificate, but somebody else cashed it in, and you'd have to do a title search to find out who that person was. The rectangular things that have E marked on them are areas that were not taken by Spanish grants or New Madrid certificates, and so they follow the grid of the Northwest Ordinance. And the key ones there are E2821, John Speed, and E2577, Samuel Black. Let's see, 2577 is there, kind of wedged in between M11 and M52. Samuel Black was the nephew of Ralph Clayton, and he was also married to Amanda McCutcheon, whose father had the adjacent farm, and Amanda's sister was married to Henry Barron, who built the Barron House, which I'll show you a little bit later. So they were very closely related. Now, this is the way the area looked in 1878, and you can see already there's quite a bit of subdivision. This is a plat book that was printed by, published by Julius Pitzman, who was a famous surveyor, and he understood the land titles better than anybody else probably. This was the first map that actually showed where buildings were located. And they're little black squares wherever there was a building. And you can see that in the Richmond Heights area, which is essentially this area here, there are a lot of subdivisions, but very few black dots. So there was a lot of speculation going on at that time. One of the key areas was this, the Rannells estate, the Rannells home farm, which was subdivided in 1871 by trustees of Charles Rannells. But they really weren't able and didn't really try to sell any of those lots until years later. The Rannells house is in Maplewood, but just a few blocks south of the Richmond Heights border. It was called Woodside, as you can see, and it's at the corner of Bradell and Folk. Edward Bradell was another property owner who owned land in the north side of what's now US 40. And I'll talk more about him later. The house was saved by the city of Maplewood, but then subsequently they abandoned it, and it's just sitting there very tragically. These are paintings of Charles and his wife, and they were very wealthy and cultured people, but unfortunately, as often happens, that isn't enough to guarantee happiness. Charles was an alcoholic, and his alcoholism eventually led to mental illness. So that's why the trustees took over his estate in 1871 when he was still living. And in addition to subdividing the property that he owned on the west side of Big Bend, they subdivided another property north of there called Central Suburbs, and that's the whole central section of University City today. All the streets there are on the grid that was established by Central Suburbs. This is a wonderful picture showing the house about 1907, and it faced south, so you're looking north, and you can see it's on the rise of a hill, but as you look north, there's nothing there, it's just farms. And that was just before the city was incorporated in 1913. Here's a closer view of that same 1878 map, and I want to point out a couple places where you can see dots. One is down here, John D. Bruno. You see a dot right there. And then the Gay family, Edward Gay, owned all this land going out along the south side of Clayton Road. And the important one dot is right there, which was where Lake Forest was later built. And let's see, there's a third one I want to mention. The Barron House was right at this corner here, and that had just been built 10 years before this map. The Bruno house on Bruno Avenue is often, well, when I first started working, it was said to have been built in 1830, but it's obviously a four-square house that was built early in the 20th century. It does have a stone foundation. It's possible that it was built by the second generation of the family to live here, but it probably wasn't built until after this land had been sold by the Bruno family, and then this lot was bought back by Alfred J. Bruno in 1922, who was a third generation. The family first came here as early as 1844, which is actually one of the earliest dates I've found, and it was a widow whose name was Reine, which means queen. Reine Gratiot Bruno came from France with 4 boys, and the youngest boy was Jean-Baptiste. So you see on this map J.B. Bruno, and then Alfred was her son. The Gays were from Louisiana, and they eventually acquired about almost 600 acres in this Richmond Heights area. They built this house in the 1860s, which they called Gay Villa, and it was a spectacular, very large house that was designed by Thomas Waring Walsh, who was one of the 3 or 4 most important architects in St. Louis at that time. And unfortunately, not much of his work survives, but the college church is at St. Louis University, and Dubourg Hall are 2 examples of Walsh's work. The father, John Gay, originally bought Samuel Black's property and then started buying up the Farland Grant and part of the McCutcheon farm also. His son, Edward, established a large wholesale grocery store downtown, and this was the building that he built down there, 121 North 2nd Street, which was also by Thomas Walsh and was published here in this illustration dates from 1860. They also had a large plantation in Louisiana, in Plaquemine Parish, and they went back and forth between the 2. And I know it's hard for us to imagine, but they actually came here during the summer months because it was cooler. And the plantation they had down in Louisiana is also still standing, and it's a spectacular building from 1856. And I actually found several good pictures of it on the internet. Edward's wife was named Lavinia, and the subdivisions to the west of the main part of the estate in the 20th century were named Lavinia Gardens and other names that used the name Lavinia. His granddaughter was also named Lavinia. The Barron House was built about 1868, and it also looks like an antebellum plantation, but it was actually built after the Civil War, and originally it did not have this portico. It was an Italianate house and with a bracketed cornice. The columns were added after 1916, probably in the 1920s, by Levi Wade Childress, who owned the Columbia Transfer Company. And the Childress family then subsequently laid out the Ridgetop subdivision just east of this property. And most of you probably remember that this was torn down by Second Baptist Church about 10 years ago or so. In 1909, you can see finally there's quite a bit of development taking place. And the 1909 Atlas also shows buildings, but where there was a subdivision, there's separate pages, and all these dark areas here are where there were separate pages. Unfortunately, the pages are so large that our scanner is not big enough for me to scan them for you, but I have a few things that I can show you here. This is just the same thing a little bit closer up and going west. You can see the name Lavinia up here, one of the subdivisions. The first important subdivision in Richmond Heights was called Richmond Heights, and it was laid out in 1896 on what had been the McCausland property by John H. Rankin, who had his own realty company. It was designed by B.F. Johnson, who was a civil engineer, and he was not as famous as Julius Pitzman, but I think this plan is interesting because it looks almost irrational in some ways because the roads are not following any logical plan on paper, but on the ground he very carefully followed the topography and created a lot of very attractive building sites by doing that. And this was actually a very progressive kind of city planning for the time. One way that this differs from post-World War II planning is that the streets connect with the surrounding neighborhood. If you look at the subdivisions in Richmond Heights after World War II, most of them have one way in and one way out, and that's it. So this is actually a more kind of civic-minded kind of plan. On this particular map, I'm showing you all the red dots, which are the famous 40 Thieves. And you may have heard of this. There are 40 houses that are all built to more or less the same plan. They were all built right after the World's Fair in 1905, after Rankin sold the remaining lots in the subdivision that were unsold, which happened to be 40 of them, to a man named Walter W. Reynolds. Now, a lot of people have said he stole the materials for the buildings off of the Forest Park site of the World's Fair, but in fact, there was a big business that was going on after the fair closed. Many of the buildings had been designed to be dismantled and they were being taken apart and sold for building materials, and he just took advantage of that. I always thought this was, I was skeptical about these 40 Thieves until I went around and actually looked at all the houses, and they actually are built obviously by the same builder. So, and as you can see in this map, which dates from 1909, they were all built within 4 years of the supposed date of construction. So I think that's one of the most interesting things in Richmond Heights, and I think all but one of them are still standing. Probably the oldest house still standing in Richmond Heights is this house, the Boning House from 1899. And when you visit this house at the corner of Bellevue and Levita, you understand what the Heights refers to, because it is at the top of a hill. The ground drops very abruptly to the east, and even from the street, you have to go up quite a grade to get into the house. And it's an interesting house. It's a rectangular house, but it looks like it's designed around this diagonal tower because the two elevations are almost identical, mirror images of each other. Hampton Park was another important early subdivision. The Hampton Park plan that we have now dates from 1910, but it originally started as Hampton Place in 1897, and Julius Pitzman designed this with very large lots, some of them as much as 6 or 7 acres. And the reason was they were trying to attract members of the St. Louis Country Club, which had just the previous year located on the Davis property, the former Ralph Clayton farm, just north of here on the west side of Hamley Road. Where the clubhouse was is now Polo Drive, and that was owned by the club. The rest of the property where the links were was leased from the Samuel Davis estate during that time. And at first, we thought that no houses were built, but recently we've discovered that there were 2 houses built on Hampton Place, and this is one of them. This photograph just recently surfaced at the Missouri History Museum. Lilburn McNair was one of the leading real estate men in St. Louis, and he was the grandson of Missouri's first governor, Alexander McNair. His wife, Minerva McNair, was a champion golfer, and she wanted to be close to the country club. So they had this large house built on Hampton Park Drive, just not too far inside the gate there at the corner of Clayton Road and Hanley. And you can see it's an interesting design because it has this huge porte cochere where you could drive your carriage around to the side of the house. Unfortunately, it burned to the ground in 1903, so it was only standing for 6 years. And there was one other house built during that time by one of the Choteau family, but it also burned. So Lucian Cabinet's house was on Hillside Drive, where the Grove house was later built. So in 1910, it was re-subdivided with smaller lots, still very ample, but smaller than originally. And at that time, about a dozen lots were sold and houses built. There was another wave of construction in the 1920s that was mainly stimulated by Edwin Grove Jr., who lived there and kind of took over the management of the real estate company. And then there's still a small group of houses that were built after World War II there also. I'm going to show you some of the houses that are maybe not the most famous ones, but just as a point of interest. Henry Wright came to St. Louis with George Kessler, who laid out the landscape for the World's Fair. Wright came here in 1902, and he stayed to restore Forest Park after the fair closed from 1905 to 1909. And then he started his own practice. And the first subdivisions he laid out were Brentmore Park and Forest Ridge. He also laid out the new St. Louis Country Club in 1914, where it is now in Ladue. In 1923, he moved to New York, and he became world famous as the designer of the Radburn Newtown, which was a famous progressive housing development in the suburbs of New York. But he's not very well known here in St. Louis. And in addition to doing planning, he also designed a few houses. And this house was my favorite one of all his work in St. Louis until the current owners painted it Battleship Gray. It's supposed to be a shingle-style house with contrasting light, trim, and dark shingles, as you see in this photograph. The Culver house, which Wright designed, had already been painted gray before I got there, so I never did see it the way it was supposed to look. And then the third house in Hampton Park is the Kerber house, which is another example of a four-square house. And in this case, they have sleeping porches on both sides of the house. So they could have spent their whole life out in those porches, I think, in the summer months. I mentioned the Groves were interested in Hampton Park. Edwin Grove Jr. was the son of the founder of what was called the Paris Medicine Company, a large pharmaceutical company. And his father had all kinds of interests, founded the Grove Park Hotel in Asheville, North Carolina, which is still a major landmark of arts and crafts architecture. Edwin Jr. was involved in the business, but he was kind of a playboy also. And he died in 1934 at the age of only 44. His estate was so confused at that point that it wasn't settled until 1963, 30 years later. There were 3 wives, among other things. But the house that he built here in 1911 is a spectacular one and kind of Spanish in style. And it has been upgraded several times. It was for sale just 2 years ago, and I see it's for sale again. This photograph of the staircase comes from the real estate brochure at that time. An earlier owner gave us a whole collection of photographs. And you can see here that not only did Grove own a lot of property in Hampton Park, but he owned the property immediately behind that became Surrey Hills, I think is the name of the subdivision, in the 1960s. So here's the house, and this is Hillside Drive here, and the swimming pool is back here. There's also a lake here. And then there was a formal garden that was walled that was back in these trees. And that garden still survives, but it's in the backyard of the adjacent houses now that were built in the 1960s. Here's the swimming pool. And here are 2 views of the garden, which was designed by Peter Seltzer, one of the few landscape architects whose names we know in the gardens here in Richmond Heights. In the 1920s, the leading architectural firm doing period revival houses was Maritz and Young. And one of the houses that they built in Hampton Park, they published in 1929 in the Maritz and Young monograph. This is about to be republished, and the authors of the book loaned me these pictures to show you tonight from the original office photographs. This is about the 3rd house in on Hampton Park Drive on the east side. And this was the front hallway with the spectacular marble floor. And notice the iron gates that separate the rooms from the hallway. That was one of the characteristic features of the firm Maritz and Young. And here's the main living room looking back into the, through that arch into the hallway and the dining room behind. Now, the city was incorporated in 1913 when really Richmond Heights subdivision was the main subdivision that existed. But there was a little bit of urgency there because Clayton had just incorporated that same year. And Clayton is, by the way, planning their centennial celebrations over this next year. And so they wanted to make sure that they had control over their own affairs. And as the city was expanded to the west year by year, they finally made the last move that took the city limits out to Lay Road in 1928. And that's an important year too, because that's the year that Deer Creek Village was incorporated west of Lay Road. So if they hadn't done that, probably the western part of Richmond Heights would be part of Ladue today. Deer Creek, McKnight, and the village of Ladue merged to form the city of Ladue in 1936. So in the 20s, as you can see by the list that I gave you, that was really the boom years for Richmond Heights. There were subdivisions being laid out every year. And so institutions were also growing right along with that. And the first important church to be organized was the Richmond Heights Presbyterian Church, which was actually started in 1907. And the present building, it took them over 20 years to complete the construction of it, but the main part of it was built during the 20s. St. Luke's Church was organized in 1914, and its building was built in 1929. And the architects here were Studi and Farrer, who also had done Our Lady of Lourdes Church on Forsyth a few years earlier. They subsequently did St. Mary Magdalene at the corner of Brentwood and Manchester Road. So they were an important firm doing Catholic churches during this period. But unlike a lot of the other firms, they did a lot of other work too. And they were actually one of the best architectural firms in St. Louis for many years. And so I think that St. Luke's is kind of an unsung architectural treasure. St. Mary's Hospital was originally designed by a very prominent architect also, Albert B. Groves, I think in 1922, and he died the next year. The convent behind it is, I think, even more important. It was designed by O'Meara and Hills, a firm that had offices in St. Louis and also in St. Paul, Minnesota. And they specialized in Catholic institutions, but they had very high design standards. And among other things, they designed the Duchesne School, the St. Agnes Home on Manchester at Woodlawn, the old DePaul Hospital on North Kings Highway, which is still standing as residence. They did the Carmelite Monastery on Clayton Road in Ladue. All those buildings are really gorgeous, outstanding buildings. And so I'm a little concerned about the future of the convent, particularly the chapel. Even if the wings of the convent were torn down, I would hope that we would be able to save the chapel. I don't need to tell you that one of the ironic things about incorporating Richmond Heights is that they weren't able to establish a school district to go with it. So the city is divided among 4 different school districts. And the 2 original schools that were built here were built by the Maplewood School District, the East Richmond, which was later Cheney School, and is now the site of the main elementary school, and then the West Richmond School in 1926, which has been languishing with the economic downturn. But this is a very nice example of schools of that era, well built, and we hope that somebody finds a use for it. In the area just to the north of the West Richmond School was a subdivision called Westmore Park Subdivision, laid out in 1922 and 23. And it's one of the most interesting in terms of the planning of it. It was the estate of Edward Bradell, who had owned this property since the 1850s. And he set up a trust in his will with 2 trustees, including George Hitchcock, who was a prominent St. Louis socialite, for the benefit of 2 beneficiaries. One was his widow, Maria Bradell. The other one was the Board of Foreign Missions of the Presbyterian Church. So it's somewhat ironic that this whole neighborhood focuses on a Catholic church, the Little Flower Church, which was laid out just 3 years after the subdivision was platted. St. Teresa of Lisieux was canonized in that year, 1925, and so churches all over the world started to be named for her. Even though this building wasn't built till 1949, it's always been the focus of this neighborhood. Another interesting thing about the Westmore Park subdivision is that all the north-south streets were named as continuations of the street names in Claverack Park to the north, which was laid out at the same time. It was Claverack Park that was the Boland family estate, not the Richmond Heights part of it. But ironically, in 1930, Claverack Park was replatted and all the street names were changed. So you now have Boland and Claytonia Terrace also is another name that was originally in Claverack but is no longer. The church that we have now at Arch Terrace was designed in 1949 by Harry Hellmuth. He was the brother of George Hellmuth of Hellmuth and Spearing, who designed the Sheldon Concert Hall, and he was the uncle of the George Hellmuth who founded HOK, Hellmuth Obata in Casablanca. So it was definitely an architectural family. He always had a separate practice, and it was based in Florissant, of all places. But this was really his masterwork, and even in his later memoirs, he always said that Little Flower Church was his greatest achievement. And here's another photograph of it with it has 2 pretty much symmetrical elevations. The thing about it is it's based on an earlier Little Flower Church in Royal Oak, Michigan, and here's a picture of it. Now, of course, we don't have the tower, but otherwise, the church has almost the same shaped dome and the same kind of polygonal plan that the church here has. And so it's an interesting sister relationship. In 1929, the Lake Forest was platted, just probably at the worst possible time because the depression, the stock market crash occurred later that year, and the depression started, and many of the initial houses were large houses that were built speculatively by real estate operators, and they held those houses for 5, 6, 7 years sometimes before they were able to sell them. But this is an interesting map that was part of a promotional brochure showing how convenient Lake Forest is, and you can see the main convenience is to the downtown Clayton, not to the rest of Richmond Heights. Here's the original plat. It was platted by 2 developers, Gorley and Huddig, and originally the cross streets all had separate names: Rainier, Sierra, Overcrest, Shasta, and Antler. And here again, in Lake Forest, they've dropped the use of those names, and all the houses are numbered according to their lot numbers. But some of those street names have continued in the neighborhoods to the west, particularly Antler, which has a couple of different separated sections. I just wanted to show a couple of drawings here. This was the display house, 121 Lake Forest, by a minor architectural firm, Klingensmith Grover, built in 1932. And this is just a little bit inside the gate, so this would have been a convenient place for visitors to take a look at a house. It took several years to sell this, and the same thing was true with this house. I had to show you the whole brochure with the slogan, "A dream come true." Preston Bradshaw was mainly a designer of high-rise office buildings and hotels. He designed the Chase Hotel, the Mayfair, the Paul Brown building downtown, and what's now Jesuit Hall, and many other similar buildings. But he did a few very nice houses. This house was built in 35, but it wasn't sold till 39, and eventually it was bought by one of the heirs to the Cry meatpacking company. On the left is our map from our survey, but you can also see the 1970 newspaper clipping showing that when Hanley Road was straightened, there had been a dogleg there at Clayton Road where you had to make, if you were going south, you had to make a left turn and then a right turn. They didn't want to tear that tower down, so they moved it back on railroad tracks. And you can see the railroad tracks in the picture here. Another thing that occurred more in the 30s than had been true earlier was multifamily housing. And Richmond Heights has several outstanding examples. This is my favorite, which our tax assessor says was built in 1953. I know that can't be true, but I haven't had a chance to research it. It's probably from the mid-30s. And also in the 30s, we had some subdivisions. Lavinia Terrace was one, Lavinia Gardens rather, where the houses were built much smaller than had been the case in the 20s because people didn't have the money to buy larger houses. And this picture and this one were sent to me by the State Highway Department because they were getting ready to tear these houses down and they wanted a record kept of them. So I thought I'd share these pictures with you. In the post-war period, Richmond Heights built a number of neighborhoods of outstanding ranch houses, and we're just now in the 2100-year decade beginning to look at the significance of ranch houses because there were so many built after the war, but a lot of them are really big, wonderful houses, and young people are beginning to recognize the importance of those. Of course, along McKnight Road, you have one subdivision after another with outstanding examples. But my favorite, of course, is Bennett Avenue in a subdivision that had actually been laid out long before that called Clayton Road Park. And this was developed by a group of professional African Americans in the 1960s against great community opposition, I must say. But they created a neighborhood that is still outstanding in appearance today. And if you look at who lived in this neighborhood, they were all people of outstanding achievement. I want to end by talking about just a few of the significant examples of modern design that we still have in Richmond Heights. Dr. Samuel Bassett's office was listed on the National Register quite a few years ago. This was designed by Ed Mutro in 1936 before he became a partner of Bill Bernuti. The firm Bernuti and Mutro was the one that was most respected for their work inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright. Bernuti actually studied with Wright. Mutro didn't, but he was maybe even more knowledgeable about Wright's design practices. Harris Armstrong is considered the dean of modern architects in St. Louis. He was the first one to build a modern building here, the Shanley Medical Building at Maryland and Bemiston in Clayton for an orthodontist. And many of his clients were physicians. But this house, the Dr. Henry Hampton house, is particularly outstanding because Dr. Hampton was an African American. His office was on Market Street in the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood, which was a largely African American community, but he was so respected that he was included in two of the most important panels. In those days they called them freeholders. I wanted to say property owners. You had to be a property owner to be a freeholder. And most of the important commissions that were charged with writing charters were boards of freeholders. He was on the board that wrote the St. Louis County Charter, which embedded civil service into the county's government to our great benefit over the last 60 years. And he also was on the board that set up the school district, the community college district, which covers both the city and the county. This house also was the childhood home of Henry Hampton Jr., who became a famous filmmaker. He's mainly remembered today for Eyes on the Prize, which was the first important documentary about the civil rights movement. And it still is kind of a foundation document for any study of the civil rights movement. The book is still in print and still used in classrooms today. So this is an unusual conjunction of architectural significance and associations with significant people. Unfortunately, this has been sitting in the redevelopment area of Richmond Heights for almost a decade now, and there's no reason why this has to be included in that development area, because it's right at the corner of Bruno and Laclede Station Road, and it is not needed for anybody's development. Here's good. Oh, good. This shows an early view when there was a balcony here. Now the balcony is enclosed, as you can see, with a kind of a glass mirador, they would call it in Spain. And I wanted to show you the offices downtown that Harris Armstrong built for Dr. Hampton at Jefferson and Pine as a result of the Mill Creek Valley Renewal Project. They gave him a new site, and he was able to build this office building, which is still standing. Second Baptist Church was designed by Frederick Dunn, one of our leading modernist architects. His name has been in the newspaper recently because he designed the Lewis and Clark Branch Library in Moline Acres, which the county library board is thinking about tearing down. But this is a drawing, a photograph of a model showing what Dunn had anticipated, an entire cloister, not just only the church. And it would have included the restoration of the Barron House there, which unfortunately was torn down. But the interior of the church is still surviving. It has this wonderful coral color characteristic of the 50s. And the windows are by Siegfried Reinhardt, one of St. Louis's greatest artists. They're not stained glass, they're enameled glass, representing the Beatitudes. Another important building is the Church of the Immaculata on Clayton Road. This shows kind of a new direction in church design, getting away from the box and going more to the fan-shaped church that we have today in many places. And this was designed by Bernard McMahon, who mainly designed office towers. He designed the Bonham, 666 Bonham. And the windows here, which are a completely different style, are by Russell Krauss, whose Frank Lloyd Wright House is now a county park. Brith Shalom Knesset Israel has two buildings, one by HOK, originally built for the school, and then their second building was built as a sanctuary by a different architect, Robert Elkington, and it's covered with these unusual blue tiles, unique in St. Louis architecture. And of course, this is now at risk because BSKI is merging with another congregation in University City, and nobody knows which one of their campuses they'll decide to keep. And I'll end with Tropicana Lanes. You may not consider this a landmark, but Modern STL, which is the mid-century modern club, had their annual meeting here last year, and they consider it one of the most important buildings in St. Louis. And I think we can all enjoy the sign. So this is a very brief overview of the riches of Richmond Heights history, and I hope you enjoy the next year.